year was 1909. Africa was not free. Almost every part of the continent had been taken over by European powers. Britain, France, Portugal, men who came from across the sea and decided they had the right to rule over lands that were not theirs. The place we now call Ghana was then known as the Gold Coast. It was rich in resources, gold, cocoa, timber, but the people who owned the land did not control its wealth. Everything answered to the British: the laws, the schools, the economy, even the future of the people. It was in this kind of world that Kwame Nkrumah was born. He was born on September 21st, 1909, in a small village called Nkrofo, in the western part of the Gold Coast. His family was not rich. His father was a goldsmith, a man who worked with his hands to survive. His mother was a trader, a strong woman who moved from place to place, buying and selling goods just to keep the family going. Life was simple but not easy. There was no electricity, no modern comfort, just hard work, community, and survival. But even in that small village, young Nkrumah was observant. He watched, he listened, he saw how his people lived under a system they did not control. He saw how decisions about their lives were made far away by people who did not even look like them. At that time, education was limited. Most schools were run by Christian missionaries, and for many African children, going to school was a rare opportunity. Nkrumah was one of the lucky ones. He was sent to a local mission school where he began to learn how to read and write. That was where everything started to change, because education did something powerful. It opened his mind. He was introduced to new ideas, new ways of thinking, and a wider world beyond his village. But there was also something else. The schools were not just teaching reading and writing. They were also teaching obedience to colonial authority. They taught African children to respect British rule, to accept it, even to admire it. But not everyone accepted that message the same way. For some, it created obedience. For others, it created questions. And in Nkrumah, it created something deeper: curiosity. Even as a young boy, he began to wonder, why are we being ruled by others? Why do we not control our own land? Why must we always follow and never lead? These were not questions many children were asking at that time, but they were already forming in his mind. As he grew older, another influence began to shape him: religion. He was raised in a Christian environment, and for a time, he even considered becoming a priest. He admired discipline, he respected structure, he believed in service. All this would later show in his leadership style. But deep inside him, there was already a different calling. Not just to serve in a church, but to serve his people. We love bringing you African stories every week. If you enjoy them, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. It really helps us to grow. As Kwame Nkrumah grew older, the small village boy began to step into a wider world. Education had opened the first door, but now life itself was about to teach him deeper lessons. After completing his early schooling, Nkrumah moved on to further his education at a teacher training college in Accra. At that time, becoming a teacher was a big achievement. It meant respect, it meant stability, it meant you had risen above the struggles of village life. And for a while, that was the path he followed. He became a teacher, standing in front of young students, holding a piece of chalk, passing knowledge from one generation to another. But teaching did more than give him a job. It gave him a voice. In the classroom, he was not just teaching lessons from books. He was beginning to understand people. He saw how young minds were shaped. He saw how ideas could influence thinking. He saw how education could either limit a person or set them free. And slowly, his own thinking began to change. Because outside the classroom, the reality of colonial rule was still everywhere. The British were still in control. Africans still had limited power in their own land. Opportunities were not equal. Voices were still suppressed. And the more educated Nkrumah became, the more uncomfortable he felt. Something was not right. He began to read more deeply, not just school books, but writings about freedom, justice, and human rights. He started to learn about other parts of the world, places where people were also fighting against oppression. And with every new idea, his mind expanded. But knowledge alone was not enough. He began to feel a growing restlessness inside him. Teaching, respectable as it was, no longer felt like his final destination. There was something bigger calling him, something beyond the classroom. Around this time, he also came under the influence of strong personalities, teachers, religious leaders, and thinkers who encouraged discipline, critical thinking, and purpose. These influences helped shape his character. They taught him how to speak with confidence, how to organize his thoughts, how to stand firm in what he believed. But they also exposed him to a difficult truth, that real change will not come easily. It will require sacrifice. It will require courage. And most importantly, it will require stepping out of comfort. For many people, getting a stable job as a teacher would have been enough. But for Nkrumah, it was only the beginning. He started to dream beyond the Gold Coast. He wanted to see the world. He wanted to learn more. He wanted to understand how other societies worked and how they dealt with injustice. That desire would lead him to make a bold decision, a risky decision, a decision that would change his life forever. He decided to leave his home, leave his job, leave everything familiar, and travel abroad. Not because he had money, not because his journey would be easy, but because he believed that somewhere out there he will find the knowledge and the tools to help free his people. It was a step into the unknown. When Kwame Nkrumah made the decision to leave the Gold Coast, he was not chasing comfort, he was chasing purpose. In 1935, he arrived in the United States of America. But what he met there was not the dream many people imagined. It was struggle, real struggle. There were days he did not have enough money to eat properly. Days he had to take on small, difficult jobs, washing dishes, working as a laborer, doing whatever he could just to survive. At times, he slept in cramped spaces. At times, he went hungry. But even in that hardship, Nkrumah did not lose focus. Because he did not travel there just to survive. He came to learn. He enrolled at Lincoln University, one of the few institutions at that time that welcomed black students. And for the first time, he found himself in an environment where black people were thinking deeply about their identity, their history, and their future. It was a different kind of education, not just academic, but intellectual and political. In America, Nkrumah encountered something that would change him forever: racism. Even though slavery had officially ended, black people were still treated as second-class citizens. Segregation, discrimination, injustice. He saw it, he experienced it, and it opened his eyes even wider. Because now he understood something clearly. The struggle of black people was not only in Africa, it was global. But Nkrumah did not grow alone. There were powerful voices, men whose ideas helped shape the way he saw the world. One of them was Marcus Garvey. Though Garvey had died before Nkrumah arrived in America, his message was still alive. Through his writings, Garvey taught that black people must believe in themselves, must take pride in who they are, and must build their own future. This message gave Nkrumah something strong: confidence. The belief that Africans were not inferior and did not need to be ruled. Another influence was W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was a scholar and a strong voice for black freedom. He believed in using education, organization, and careful planning to fight injustice. From him, Nkrumah learned that position alone was not enough. You needed structure, you needed direction, you needed a plan. Then there was George Padmore, a man who would later become one of Nkrumah's closest allies. Padmore understood colonial system deeply. He knew how power worked and how to challenge it. From him, Nkrumah learned how to organize people, how to build movements, how to turn ideas into action. And slowly, these influences began to come together. From Garvey, confidence. From Du Bois, intellectual strength. From Padmore, political strategy. At the same time, Nkrumah was discovering a powerful idea: Pan-Africanism. The belief that all African people, whether at home or abroad, must unite and take control of their own destiny. This idea spoke directly to his heart. It gave direction to the questions he had been asking since childhood. It turned his curiosity into conviction. He was no longer just wondering why Africa was under foreign control. Now, he believed it must change, and that he could be part of that change. But the journey was still not easy. Balancing school and survival was a daily struggle. Sometimes he had to pause his studies to work. Sometimes He pushed through exhaustion just to attend classes. Yet, he did not give up. Year after year, he kept going. He earned degrees. He gained knowledge. He built connections. And most importantly, he built belief. Believe in himself. Believe in his people. Believe that Africa could be free. After spending years in America, Nkrumah moved to Britain. There he continued his studies, but also became more deeply involved in political movements. He connected with other African and Caribbean leaders. He helped organize meetings and conferences. One of the most important moments was his involvement in the Pan-African Congress, a gathering of black leaders determined to end colonial rule. By this time, Nkrumah was no longer just a student. He had become an activist, a man with a clear mission. The quiet village boy who once sat and wondered about the world had not found his answer. Africa must be free, and he would dedicate his life to making it happen. But believing in change and creating it are two different things. Now, it was time to go home, not as a teacher, not as a student, but as a man ready to challenge an empire. When Nkrumah returned to Gold Coast, he did not come back quietly. He came back ready to act, ready to speak, ready to challenge a system that had ruled for decades. By this time, the desire for change was already growing among the people. Educated Africans, workers, farmers, many were beginning to question British rule, but they needed direction, they needed a voice, and soon they found one. In 1947, Nkrumah was invited to join a political group called the United Gold Coast Convention. It was led by educated elites, lawyers, businessmen, men who also wanted independence. But the difference was not that one group wanted freedom and the other did not. It was how fast and by what method that freedom should come. The leaders of the UGCC believed in gradual change, negotiation, constitutional reform, step by step. But Nkrumah believed that time had come for immediate action. He believed the people themselves must be directly involved in the struggle. So he went to them. He traveled from town to town. He spoke in simple language. He connected with ordinary citizens, market women, workers, young people, and they listened. For the first time, many people felt included in the fight for independence. But tension was rising. In 1948, protests broke out in the Gold Coast. Ex-servicemen who had fought in the Second World War marched peacefully, demanding their rights. But the situation turned violent. Shots were fired. People died. The country was shaken. The British authorities reacted quickly. They arrested Nkrumah and other leaders, believing their activities had contributed to the unrest. But instead of ending his influence, his arrest increased it. People began to see him not just as a politician, but as a symbol of resistance. Soon after his release, it became clear that his path and that of the UGCC had separated. So in 1949, He formed its own party, the Convention People's Party. His message was clear: self-government now, not tomorrow, not in the future, now. And the people responded. In 1950, he launched Positive Action, a campaign of strikes and civil disobedience. He was arrested again, but in 1951, the British organized elections as part of a gradual move towards self-rule. Even though Nkrumah was in prison, his party was active. His supporters campaigned across the country. They carried his message to the people, and the people made their choice. They voted massively for him. A man in prison was choosing to lead. Faced with this reality, the British released him. And just like that, the prisoner became a leader. The struggle had entered a new phase. By the early 1950s, Nkrumah had become a central figure in the struggle for independence. But he was not alone. Across Africa and across the world, colonial systems were weakening. After the Second World War, empires were under pressure. Colonies were demanding freedom, and change was becoming inevitable. Nkrumah was leading the change in the Gold Coast, but he was also part of a larger movement of history. In 1954, elections were held again. His party won decisively. He became prime minister. Still, full independence had not yet been achieved. Negotiations with the British continued. Tension remained, but Nkrumah stayed firm. And then, on March 6, 1957, history was made. The Gold Coast became Ghana, the first African country south of the Sahara to gain independence from the colonial rule. It was a moment that shook the world. Crowds filled the streets. Flags were raised. Hope was everywhere. And as Nkrumah declared independence, his message went beyond Ghana. The independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of Africa. It was not just a national victory, it was a continental signal. Africa was rising. With independence achieved, the real work began. Nkrumah now had to turn vision into reality. He dreamed of a modern Ghana with industries, education, and strong infrastructure. He launched major projects, roads, schools, factories, and the famous Akosombo Dam. He wanted rapid development. He wanted Ghana to become a model for Africa. And beyond Ghana, he pushed strongly for African unity. He believed that divided, African countries would remain weak, but united, they could stand strong. Yet leadership brought difficult choices. Nkrumah believed that political division could weaken the young nation. Ethnic tensions, regional differences, and political rivalry could break the country apart. So he began to centralize power. To him, a one-party system was not just about control, it was about unity and speed. He believed a strong single direction would help Ghana develop faster. But not everyone agreed. To many Ghanaians, this began to feel like a loss of freedom. Opposition voices were reduced, criticism became risky, and while development continued, concerns began to grow. By the mid-1960s, Nkrumah stood at the height of his power, but also at the edge of growing crisis. His government had achieved much, but it was also under pressure. The economy was struggling. Some major projects were expensive. Cocoa prices fell on the global market. Ordinary people began to feel the strain. At the same time, political tensions increased. The one-party state, introduced in 1964, deepened concerns. To Nkrumah, it was a way to protect unity, but to many others, it felt like power was becoming too concentrated. Some opposition figures were detained, voices of criticism reduced. Support began to weaken in certain areas, especially among elites, professionals, and sections of the military. At the same time, the global political climate was tense. The Cold War was shaping world politics. Nkrumah's policies and international alliances made some foreign powers uncomfortable. Inside Ghana and outside it, pressure were building. Then in 1966, while Nkrumah was on a trip abroad, the military struck a coup. His government was overthrown, just like that. From the heights of power to exile, it was sudden, but it had been building over time. A combination of decisions, economic challenges, political tensions, and wider global forces. The story of his fall was not caused by one thing alone, but by many forces coming together at the same moment. After the 1966 coup, Kwame Nkrumah became a man without a country. The leader, who had once stood before cheering crowds, now watched events from a distance. He went into exile in Guinea, where he was received with respect and honor. But exile is never easy, because even when a man is given shelter, his thoughts remain with home. In Guinea, Nkrumah continued to write, to speak, and to think. He did not abandon his vision. He still believed in African unity. He still believed that the continent must stand together politically, economically, and culturally. But now, there was also time for reflection. Time to look back on the journey from Nkrumah to independence, to power, and then to exile. His life had been filled with bold decisions. Some had brought freedom and pride to millions. Others had created tension, opposition, and fear. History, as always, did not judge him in simple terms. To some, he remained a hero, the man who helped break colonial rule and gave hope to a continent. To others, he was a warning, a leader whose concentration of power limited the very freedoms he once fought for. Both views would become part of his story. In his final years, his health began to fail, and in 1972, Kwame Nkrumah died in Bucharest, Romania. Far from Ghana, far from the people whose life he had changed. But death did not end his influence, because the question he raised and the vision he carried remained alive. What does true independence mean? How should power be used? How can African nations develop without losing their freedom? These are questions that did not end with him. Today, his name still stands in Ghana's history, not as a perfect figure, but as a powerful one. A man of vision, a man of action, a man of contradictions. From a small village boy to a leader who changed the course of history. Kwame Nkrumah's story reminds us that nation building is never simple. Leadership is never easy. And history is never one-sided. But it also reminds us of something else. That one person with conviction and courage can help awaken a people and begin a movement that outlives them. That is the legacy he left behind.